Hi, I am Dr. Felice Gersh, your integrative OBGYN, and so sorry I have just a little bit of laryngitis today, but I didn't want to disappoint by postponing a very important conversation about dense breasts and the role of estrogen. This is so important because this is now really widespread that the knowledge, and it goes to the foundational issues of breast cancer, that breast density is a risk factor for developing breast cancer. Now, I've talked about this a little bit in the past, but questions come up all the time, so I just want to really review it and make sure it's really clear what is going on with breasts and the density. So first, it's important to know what are breasts consisting of. And when they do a mammogram and they say they look dense, what is it they're looking at on the mammogram that is causing this picture of density? Well, as you know, the breasts have a critically important role in human survival. Breasts are designed to create food, breast milk, for infants. Because back in the day, and of course we now know this is true today, nothing is better for infants than nature's own produced breast milk from the mom. Now, we do have substitutes today, but this was not exactly available back thousands of years ago. So breasts were designed for the purpose of feeding babies. So what does the breast do? How does this happen? Well, the breast consists of lobular areas, and in the lobules, the milk is created. And then it enters the ducts. You can think of the ducts as the highway system to deliver the milk from all over the breast, all over these lobules that are creating the breast milk, to reach the nipple, where there are many little exits that allow the infant to use the little baby's mouth to express the milk from the breast into the baby's mouth so that the baby gets nourishment. So when a woman is young in the reproductive years, the breasts have a lot of these structures because it is during those years that women would use them for creating babies and then nursing them. So we have a lot of lobular tissue and a lot of ducts in the breasts of young reproductive aged women. And what supports those structures, of course, are the female hormones. I'm not talking about men. I know they exist in men, but we're focusing on women. Estrogen in the form of estradiol that comes from the ovaries, and progesterone. So that's what maintains the structure of these breasts. And of course, we know during puberty, that's when the breasts develop. Before puberty, little girls shouldn't have the development of breasts. That should be only after they start having functional ovaries. So when you are in the young reproductive years, you have a lot of ducts and a lot of lobules in the breast tissue. But what else is in the breast tissue? Well, there is connective tissue and fat. That's what is supporting these structures that are involved in the milk production and delivery system. So you have all these hormones and you have all these really vital structures of the breast. And then what happens when you age? Well, if you do not have hormones on board, those structures literally start to shrivel up. And over time, if a woman goes through menopause and years go by, she is not on any hormone therapy, those breasts theoretically should, and I'll tell you when they don't, they should have these ducts and lobules that literally shrivel up, leaving predominantly fat tissue. When you do a mammogram on a very young woman, say she's in her 20s or 30s, every woman will have what I call whiteout. The breasts are so dense that you can't see a darn thing. It's like, whoa, like a snowstorm. You do see nothing. It's whiteout because there are so many ducts and so many lobules in those breasts that you can't see anything at all, particularly. Now, as women get older and then their estrogen and progesterone are gone, if they're not having therapeutic replacement, then those ducts will start to shrivel, the lobules start to shrivel. And then you have on mammography, when you do an imaging of those breasts, you have less whiteness, less whiteout, and what we call density is actually those breast structures that make the breast look white on a mammogram. You can't see much of any detail because of all, it's like you have a dense forest and you have all these branches and you have all these leaves and you can't see, like, well, what if there's a little bird sitting in one of those trees? You can't see it because the trees are all filled with leaves and there's branches everywhere, so you cannot see that little bird sitting in the tree. But what if you now have no leaves and half the branches are gone, and then you have a bird sitting on a branch? You're going to see it. That's what it's all about when you're looking with a mammogram for breast cancer. If you have dense breasts, because you have all these lobules and you have all these ducts and they're just filling up everything, all the space, then if you have a cancer that forms typically on the ducts, the most common form of breast cancer is ductal carcinoma, but you can also have lobular carcinoma. Okay, so that's less common than the ductal carcinoma. But if you get a cancer in either of those places and you don't have so much density because you don't have so many growing and vibrant ducts and lobules, then if like you have a little cancer that's sitting in there, you're more likely to see it with the mammogram. So it's like it's always stark winter in an elderly breast because you don't have all those plush and lush ducts and lobules. So remember, estrogen and the form of estradiol from the ovaries and progesterone maintain those structures and keep the breast looking dense during the reproductive years. So what happens if you're an older woman many years into menopause and you get a mammogram and they say you have dense breasts? Well, then the question is, why would you have dense breasts? Shouldn't those structures have been shriveling so that you don't have all that whiteout? When you don't have whiteout, you see black, and then you see the contrast. So you can actually see if there's a cancer much more readily. Well, the bottom line is that when people age, they tend to become more systemically, body-wide inflamed. And in women post-menopause, if you're not on hormones, and then in particular, if you're not leading the most healthy lifestyle, you're going to have more systemic inflammation. Inflammation will involve the breasts as well. No organ is spared. When you have inflammation in the breasts, it turns out that the fat tissue and the connective tissue contains an enzyme called aromatase that is activated by inflammation. It like turns it on. So then this enzyme aromatase converts circulating androgens, mostly, predominantly, but not exclusively, from the adrenal gland, and converts them into mostly estrone. So estrone is an estrogen that is made in fat tissue in postmenopausal women when you have inflammation. And when you have that scenario, you're going to have this estrone, which predominantly works on the alpha receptor. Estradiol works on all the receptors in a balanced way. Well, it turns out that breast cancers are always alpha receptor positive when they are receptor positive for estrogen. It is the alpha receptor. So now you have the perfect storm of creating a lot of density, because when you have inflammation and you're now upregulating aromatase, and you're making locally produced. This isn't coming from anywhere but in the breast. This is directly in the breast tissue. You're making locally produced estrone. Estrone causes not just breast cancer to grow if you have breast cancer, but it will cause the structures of the breast, the ducts, the alveoli, to grow, or the word we use for grow is proliferate. So suddenly you're having what looks like rejuvenation of the breast tissue. They start looking like a younger woman's breast because they have all of these ducts and alveoli that are now growing. But this is not the way it should be. This is not the normal hormonal environment that a breast is happy in. You have inflammation, and you have just the estrone, or predominantly estrone. That's because when you have a lot of inflammation, there's an enzyme that can help convert estrone to estradiol, the balanced estrogen. But inflammation downregulates, so it slows the response or function of that enzyme, so you can't readily convert the estrone type of estrogen made in the breast into estradiol. So you end up with estrone predominantly. And as I mentioned, estrone activates the alpha receptor, which triggers growth of these ducts and the lobules. So if you're an older woman and you have a mammogram and it shows very dense breasts, and they do rate them, it's the density that is the most severe is the most risky. So it's typically when you have extremely dense breasts that it is a true sign of what? What's this a sign of? It's a sign that you have a lot of inflammation in your breast that's upregulating this enzyme to produce estrogen in the form of estrone locally in that breast. And that means you have inflammation. So inflammation causes DNA instability and breakage. And when you have also a metabolically unhealthy woman, where you have often insulin resistance, higher levels of blood sugar, and so on, because it's usually a package deal, then you have the perfect storm to create breast cancer. Unrelenting inflammation and estrone, which creates growth factors in an uncontrolled way, inappropriately induced by the inflammation in the breast. If you did a mammogram on that woman, you will find very dense breasts. And that would say, hey, this woman has a lot of inflammation going on in her breasts. That in itself is a risk factor for cancer. Chronic inflammation underlies all the problems of aging, including cancer. Then you have a growth factor that's being produced, all this estrone, which can promote the growth of the breast cancer. So dense breasts, if you see them on a mammogram in a woman who is not on hormone therapy, is always a concern, because it means that she has inflammation in her breast. Now, you may have heard of thermography. Thermograms are okay. You can have them if you want them. They're not really a breast cancer screening. They're a inflammation or heat. Thermogram is about heat, because inflammation would generate heat. So I don't utilize thermograms, because if you have inflammation, then you're told go get a mammogram. So if there's a concern, you might as well get the mammogram, because that's where you're going to end up anyway. But of course, if you want to get a thermogram, you can. Just know what it is. It's looking for inflammation, and there are other causes of inflammation as well. So if you have young breasts and you do a mammogram for some reason, you're going to find dense breasts. That's why young women, for example, who are still cycling, still having hormones, like in their 40s, it is really hard to interpret those mammograms because the increased density, because they have ovarian produced hormones supporting these structures in the breasts and they're not shriveling, those women are going to have naturally dense breasts. Now, if you have a young woman and she has extremely dense breasts beyond what any typical young woman would have, well, that could be a warning, because then she may have excessive inflammation in her breasts for some reason. Maybe it's endocrine disruptors, maybe it's chronic stress, nutrient insufficiencies or something, chronic infections, but she has very, very severely dense breasts, more than you would see even in a normal hormonalized young woman. Then you have to take note of it. So I don't want to discount that at any age, even young women, if for some reason they have a mammogram, that dense breasts mean nothing because they always have hormones. Most of the time, it just means they have hormones. That's all it means. But, you still have to be on alert for some exceptional type of density that seems extreme. Now, if you give hormones at levels that are reasonably close to levels that a woman would have during her reproductive years, she is going to do what with those hormones? She's going to maintain all the different organ systems and structures of the body. That's the goal. We want women, no matter how old they are, to have cells that get the hormones, which is the information delivery system that they would have when they're optimally functioning at a younger age. And then, of course, we want to provide all the other critically important things like all the nutrients. We don't want to have inflammation. We don't want to have chronic infections, and so on. So when we give hormones to try to optimize health, not just these little tiny doses that are just to suppress some symptoms, but we're really trying to maintain the brain function, the bone health, the skin health, the gut health, the cardiovascular health at an optimized degree, as best we can. Nothing is going to be the same as being 21, but to the best of our ability, then those same levels of hormones that are somewhat similar to a healthy woman in her 20s are going to have the same effect, hopefully, on her bones, on her brain, on her arteries, and so on, and skin, and also on her breasts. It's a package deal. I can't say hormones go everywhere but skip the breasts. That doesn't work. I can't say hormones go everywhere but skip the uterus. No, if I give the hormones, they're going to go to the uterus. They're going to grow the uterine lining. And we can talk about more of that another day. You can't give physiologic levels of hormones to a woman who has a uterus and not expect the uterine lining to grow, because that's what hormones do in the uterine lining. And if you give them, they have breasts, they're going to have the ducts and the lobules to be sustained. They're not going to shrivel up because they have the hormone support. So if you are on physiologic levels of hormone therapy in the menopause, which I feel are optimal, just like we'd want to optimize everything to be like you were in your 20s. Granted, there's no way we're going to turn any woman in her 50s into the health of a woman who's optimized in her 20s. We just have it as a goal. We want to come as close as we reasonably can, understanding that hormones are about health. That's just what it is. Young women have hormones and they are at their healthiest time, but then we have to add in all the lifestyle stuff, because even young women can be unhealthy if they eat all the wrong food, never go to sleep, sit on their butt all the time, and so on. So if you are on physiologic amounts of hormones and you are a menopausal woman, no matter how old you get, your breasts won't know how old you are. They're going to respond to the hormones the way they're programmed to respond, which means the ductal cells and the lobular cells are going to stay alive and vibrant. They're not going to shrivel up. So if you are on that type of hormone therapy and you have a mammogram, you will have dense breasts. Now, if you have ultra dense breasts, then of course that is always important. We're never going to discount findings. And it's important to know that mammography in a woman on those doses of hormones will not be able to see a cancer as well as if all the, like, it's like dead of winter and all the leaves on the tree are gone and half the branches are gone, and you have a cancer that's sitting on a branch, and then you can see it just like you can see the bird on the branch when you have no leaves and half the branches are gone. But if you have leaves everywhere, if everything is lush and healthy and beautiful in the middle of summer, when you have leaves everywhere, then if you have a bird sitting in that tree, you're not going to be easily able to find it. So there are compromises in everything. If you are an older woman and you have physiologic hormones on board, the mammogram will show densities. It's going to be a dense breast because you have hormones supporting all the structures of the breast. And guess what else? You just need to know that, because if you have a breast cancer, it could be missed. And these are choices. But here's another good thing to know. If you're on hormones, you're lowering your risk of breast cancer. That is now established, that estrogen in the form of estradiol is not causing breast cancer. It is lowering the risk. When these evaluations have been done, and we look at the one study that goes out for a long time, which I normally talk against, but in the Women's Health Initiative, the estrogen-only arm, even going out 20 years, showed a significant reduction in breast cancer in the women who took the estrogen, but not the MPA, the medroxyprogesterone acetate, that fake progesterone, a fake one that turns out to actually increase a little bit the risk of developing breast cancer because it's a fake progesterone. Now, there was one study that came out, and it was talking about that estrogens can be involved in the initiation of breast cancer. Now, it's a very complicated study, and it did not happen in a human. It happened like in test tubes, and it was utilizing breast cancer cells and showing that there was certain interesting way that you can have a breakage and bridging of chromosomes between cells, and that could, they felt, initiate breast cancer from estrogen. But here's the thing. This was involving breast cancer cells already. And it's important to know that once tissue becomes cancerous, the genes become programmed differently. So I'm not ever going to have a closed mind about anything. But that one study, that does not change anything for anybody at this point, because it was using breast cancer cells in like a non-human environment, like in a test tube, and it was showing changes in cells that were already from a breast cancer. And knowing that gene expression in cancer tissue is already modified. And there's no question that estrogens can have different effects on breast cancer when you have a cancer already in existence, that it could then turn things on in different ways. One of the beautiful things about estrogen is that it creates growth factors. In the normal environment, growth factors are about repairing, replacing, sustaining, rejuvenating. If you want to have young tissues in your body, you need to have growth factors. When you have inflammation, which is what is always associated with cancer, always, then it hijacks estrogen. So what we want to do as best we can is to start hormone therapy early during the perimenopause, before all this chronic inflammation has occurred, and then maintaining all the healthy lifestyle choices to keep all the cells in the body functioning as close as possible to a healthy reproductive aged woman's cells. Who gets more breast cancer, pre or postmenopausal women? By far, it is postmenopausal women, by far. And the biggest risk factor is obesity. And a second risk factor would be alcohol use and smoking, not having hormones. So it's really important to know that the real risks to getting breast cancer are not human bioidentical hormones. It is inflammation that's related to unhealthy lifestyles and loss of hormones, not having hormones. Remember, estradiol modulates, it regulates the inflammation process. It triggers the initiation of inflammation when it's needed for damaged tissue to deal with it, or pathogens like bacteria, viruses trying to invade our body. And then it causes inflammation to subside and causes healing and resolution of inflammation when you no longer need it. Having physiologic levels of hormones in the body at every age can help maintain a normal state of not having inflammation except when you really need it. Without those vital life hormones, you go into a pro-inflammatory state, which can trigger cancers. In younger women who do get cancer, breast cancer, they've now associated it in large part due to inflammation from a variety of sources at a younger age, and heavily to endocrine disruptors, chemicals that women are exposed to at critical stages of life, like at puberty, when tissues are developing and breasts are developing, and then sort of lying in wait, creating like a dormancy that breast cancers will develop later, like exposures to pesticides, like when you're 13, can create an increased risk of breast cancer when you're in your 30s or early 40s. So it's not having hormones that gives women breast cancer. It's not having hormones and having other creators of inflammation. And dense breasts are not unimportant to recognize, but what is important is to understand, what are you looking at when you see a mammogram and it says dense breasts? What does it mean? And it means that when you have dense breasts, you have estrogen in that breast. If you're giving women hormones, then of course they're going to have dense breasts if you give them enough. If they're making hormones from their ovaries, then they will have dense breasts. If they have dense breasts and they're not on any hormones, they're not getting exogenous hormones, then it means they have inflammation in their bodies, and particularly in their breasts. And inflammation will turn on estrogen production locally and systemically in other fat tissue of the body, and that will cause ductal proliferation. And in an inflamed environment, it can promote the initiation of cancer. So I hope this straightens out the story of what does it mean if you have dense breasts. And if there's confusion still, let me know. I want to make sure you really understand what this means, because this comes up all the time. And more to come, because women's bodies are fascinating and we're going to explore all aspects.